Welcome to the brief from Mesh, the show where Mesh's team sits down with the experts shaping the future of digital finance. Before we get into it, the views shared today are our own and don't represent the official positions of any organization. Nothing here is legal or financial advice.
My name is Ron Quaranta. I'm privileged to be chairman of the Wall Street Blockchain Alliance and also very privileged to serve as a member of the Mesh Policy Advisory Board. We have Rosalind and Dylan here with us. Rosalind, Dylan, we've got a lot to cover.
Hello, everybody. I'm Rosalind Corrado. I'm the Chief Innovation Officer and newly announced Chief Customer Officer at Vouched. I work on helping build our Know Your Agent market. A lot of that involves working closely with Dylan and his engineering team to build the right solutions to bring to market. And now we're unifying all of our identity solutions and the customer strategy behind that for both human identity verification and agent identity verification under that CCO role. So excited to be here and talk to you about agentic identity, Ron.
Hi, everyone. I'm Dylan Hobbs. I'm the founding principal engineer at Vouched, and I'm the author of Chaos, which is our Know Your Agent operating system. It's our protocol on agent identity, delegation, and authorization.
Thanks so much. Rosalind, Dylan, let's dive into it. We've been hearing about AI for a long time already. We've been hearing about agentic commerce for a long time. And I think some of the things that are coming up, and certainly the Policy Advisory Board conversations, is what do we mean by an agent when we look at identity and the challenges of identity? Because throughout commerce, identity meant a person. What is that foundational principle now that we have AI agents that can engage in commerce and do business on our behalf? What does that look like, Rosalind?
A lot of this is still emerging, Ron, but for us, what's been interesting is there was this huge emphasis on agentic commerce, I think, especially at the beginning of the year. Everyone expected this big bang moment of humans were going to have agents rush to websites and complete purchases on their behalf. What's emerging now is people are understanding that agentic identity is the prerequisite to agentic commerce, right? And so what we hear from organizations is, I'm not as worried about the transaction. I need to worry about agents actually finding me and knowing that they can transact on my site. And so a lot of what we're seeing in terms of that shift is the identity layer being that prerequisite, like I said, to the commerce and the transport layer that's already been being built, right, in terms of the payment rails. And so what does that actually mean in practice? That's why Dylan and the team authored Chaos, because you need to know, who is this agent that's coming to my site? And the number one question, the $1 million question is, can I trust this agent? Are they a good actor or a bad actor? A lot of people think that agents coming to your website are these mysterious, anonymous gray robots that are just going to come to your site and wreak havoc. But from us and from our standpoint, we've built our solutions around, you can trust that agent. You authenticate them the moment they land on your site, then you know exactly who they are, the human they're associated with, and then what permissions they're delegated. Because a travel agent shouldn't necessarily be allowed to complete a financial transaction on your website. And so all of that is completely within your control. Dylan, would you add anything to that, just given that you authored the Chaos protocol?
What's unique to the landscape right now is we have worked with computers like machines. We have a lot of infrastructure built around. We're used to having that be deterministic, where 1 + 1, we know the outcome, it's predictable behaviors. And now we're edging into this land where it's a little bit more probabilistic. There's a little bit of like sentience in a way with the AI. And that's where a lot of unknown edge cases and outcomes can happen. And that's why we kind of anchor those two in identity. And we argue that it's useful to actually identify that probabilistic nature of whatever system's interacting with yours.
Rosalind, did he just say sentience? Is the singularity now here, Dylan? I'm a little concerned. I may not have prepared well enough. Dylan, Rosalind, really good points. I've been fascinated in the context of this conversation about payments and how payments in an agentic world are evolving. And I'm thinking about some of the solutions we've seen proposed and put out there. I believe it was MasterCard and things like agentic tokens that represent tokenized capabilities to do payments, for example, on behalf of someone else. I think, if I remember correctly, I had notes, know your agent using zero knowledge proofs. Let me ask this question. It feels like the payments world is trying to wedge agentic commerce into existing models and then layer on something like ZK proofs, for example. Dylan, I don't mean to be too wonkish about it, but I want to hear both of your perspectives. Is that the right model for payments in an agentic world?
So I think that's a really good question. If you use MCP, for example, as a reference, that was created by Anthropic, donated to the Linux Foundation. It allows models to tap in or connect to other services, very similar to an API. The issue there, what you touched on, is bolting on existing infrastructure or patterns as the solution to it. So with MCP, the solution there was to really just bolt on OAuth. And that creates a lot of issues because when you're giving an agent your OAuth token, really possession of token is essentially possession of your identity. And from that services perspective, they're just seeing that user or that customer take those actions, and there's really no knowledge or insight that it's actually an AI acting on their behalf. When it comes to the payment rails, I have to give credit to A2P from Google, for example, because they're using verifiable credentials. They have this notion of a mandate, and that is what the customer to the agent relationship is on what the agent is allowed to do when it comes to spend and purchases. I think the area that's really left out with all of that is that only covers a small sliver of that behavior or that interaction. You don't really have this notion of the before the cart leading up to that transaction, or exactly what form of authentication or permission to the customer give to that agent to actually verify that they were allowed to spend $500 and not $50, for example.
Dylan, for the audience who may not know OAuth, could you just describe that really briefly?
Yeah, so OAuth is like federated identity. It's the sign in with Google, sign with Gmail, sign in with Facebook. It's a way for a service to allow users a quick way to access or create an account, but you're relying on that third-party provider like Google, for example, to share your credentials, your name, your email address, whatever it is that they've requested. On behalf of Google, they're basically giving that service your info or data that you've consented to when you do that sign-in flow.
Dylan, it's a really interesting point. One of the things I've been focusing on as well is, what about agents of agents down the road, multi-agent capabilities? And I don't want to muddy the waters because I realize, Rosalind, to your point, we're still trying to get the lay of the land on agentic commerce and identity. But Dylan, put the future forecasting hat on. What does it look like when we're talking about agentic commerce and I have agents that can create agents for them?
That's a really good question. And I think that's a big part that we haven't really explored yet as far as the landscape. In the protocol in Chaos, we actually have agent to agent planned. It's through attenuation. So when you delegate to an agent, you might give an agent the capability to spend on your behalf or to access your account. But if that agent is going to delegate to another agent or spin one up, you have to have some sort of attenuation built into this so that when those hops occur, the agents down the chain aren't getting escalated permissions, and they're actually getting permissions that are very specific and scoped to a specific action.
Including time-bound scopes?
I think time-bound is actually also another pretty big issue, just because machine time versus human time, it's very different. An agent could do a lot more damage in 5 minutes of access to someone's Google Drive than a human could. So yes, time-bound is a factor, but I think actually it should be spend-based and like usage-based, much like how you would mint a token and then burn it when it's being used. The same thing should occur when you're doing these like multi-delegation or multi-hop workflows.
Dylan, thanks. Rosalind, let's talk about the people side of this. When we look at your role at Vouch, when we look at the work you and I do and the work at the Policy Advisory Board at Mesh, for example, is how do we take what Dylan's talking about, which is really critical to this conversation about identity, and how do we explain that in people and business terms? What's that dialogue for you?
Yes, that is why I'm here, Ron. That is the fundamental part of my role, is to translate that. But it's very much necessary, right? Because I think the complexity and the hype around AI is intimidating, right? And is preventing a lot of enterprises from moving in this direction and adopting AI. What we're doing here at Vouched is we're acknowledging that before we can even make the sale, there's a lot we need to do to educate and drive awareness of what's available, what's possible. We hold sessions just to give you a crash course in what's been happening in AI. So back when OpenClaw and Moltbook were a hype and a big thing, we would talk to people about that. A lot of organizations we talk to won't even use AI note takers. They're prohibited from using them because of the fear of the potential risk of AI. And so giving people a sense of why do people say that it's so powerful and so exciting using AI, just give them a little bit of a taste of that. helps them feel empowered, helps them feel like they can actually go forward and make educated decisions about their agentic policies, right? So I think all of us working in this space, we take it for granted a little bit, but it's important for us to be able to pay it forward and help others understand what's actually happening.
Yeah, Rosalind, like every field that so many of us have been involved in for the past 100 years, it feels like it's always about the education curve with colleagues and clients and other stakeholders. I want to expand upon something you both referenced, and Dylan, this probably piggybacks on something you mentioned a bit earlier. When we talk about agents, let me refocus or reframe that. I'm sure for all of us, there's not a day that goes by where someone's not trying to spoof an email on us or doing some level of not good activity. I guess my concern or question becomes, what happens when malicious actors can spoof agents? And is that yet another layer of cybersecurity that we haven't even begun to understand yet?
That's a good question. I think you stop trying to win a lookalike contest and demand proof instead. So anything that's self-declared, if we're talking about a network request, like a user agent string, a name, or even just a published profile, a lot of the standards are real. You have almost like an agent card that's being presented, and that's the agent saying who it is and who it's coming from. A lot of that stuff can be copied. So what we actually need now is cryptographic proof. And we need to actually demand that for the most sensitive actions. So spoofing is really not a question, right? And all of this will depend on, from service to service, what their own security posture is or what their own risk appetite is in the scenario. There should be policies and enforcement of those policies on the highest or largest blast radius actions so that they can be cryptographically verified versus just something that's presented as static text.
Dylan, do I have permission to call you in a few months when we add cryptographic proof and quantum computing to the conversation?
Yeah, absolutely.
The core part of how we operate, Ron. I would say, to build off of that, it's not a question of if bad actors start using agents maliciously, it's already happening. It's not even a question of when, it's happening now, because we talk to organizations that say the bad guys are very smart, right? We all know this. And the same folks that were using bots to try to attack their software and pirate software are using agents now, right? And so this is another reason to generate urgency around leaning into AI, because the bad guys are getting smart. So you want your defenses to be just as strong to be able to combat that.
Rosalind, really good point. And in response to us wrap up this particular section, when we talk about some of this, a lot of people in different parts of different industries are saying, well, we need government involved. And I come from a school where government's probably not the most efficient way to tackle every problem in the world. But Rosalind, is there something to that kind of perspective?
There's a balance, right? It's, to what degree do you want government involved? And I think from the perspective of looking out for the benefits of the masses and the public, they could potentially define outcomes, they could define certain guardrails. But for certain things like standards and protocols, we would want that to come from various groups that are working on developing this now. So the government kind of tells you what your end goal is, but you as the group, as a public, help define that. And we're seeing that emerge now in terms of agentic identity standards. So we have chaos. There's a few other standards out there, and that's natural at this kind of point in the life cycle with AI adoption, where you're going to see a few competing standards, but they'll eventually coalesce and the ideas will cross-pollinate, and then one unifying standard will emerge. That's my perspective. Dylan, would you agree, disagree?
Yeah, totally agree. I think that's the same way that if we're going back to government issuing on TLS, they didn't demand TLS, they required protection of data, and the industry converged and TLS was the answer. So I think governments will regulate the properties, not the protocols, and the standard competition will sort itself out underneath.
Rosalind, Dylan, good points. When we talk about agentic commerce, when we talk about payments, there's certain aspects that I come to, and probably because I've had way too many legal conversations, and for anyone in the audience who's a lawyer, don't take that the wrong way. But one of the things that always comes back to my mind, Rosalind, is liability. And I'm thinking this was an education for me talking about this podcast when we looked at things like Reg E and authorization of payments using card code or other means. Let me go back to the previous comment I made. Do we just jam in agentic commerce into Reg E for the purposes of things like payments?
This goes back to one of your original questions, Ron, where we can't retrofit existing regulations and standards and protocols for agents. We're in a brave new world. So there is an opportunity to revisit that and redefine that, especially. So I believe Reg E is specifically around delegated purchasing authority, right? So AI agents technically do not fall under that scope. And so it's important for us to be able to revisit and redesign that based on the parameters we know about agents today.
Just to push back on that a little bit, as Regulation E sits in the world that payments providers know, it's probably not the best fit given some of the capabilities we see coming.
Yes, 100%. I think even starting very simply from how do you actually authenticate and identify an agent compared to how you authenticate and identify a human? How do you verify that human has the right purchasing authority delegated to them versus an agent? And you need human agent binding, right? Where you don't necessarily need that with just the consumer themselves when they're performing a transaction. When we think about regulation, it's not just regulation on that purchasing authority in Reg E. For us, it's also conversations we're having around insurance, right? And who's liable and fraud and chargebacks, right? So who's liable if an agent goes rogue, right? Or there's a malicious kind of attempt and someone else hijacks your agent and completes a purchase. So all of these are questions that have to be determined and figured out. Some insurance companies have actually dropped coverage for AI, right? So they're not actually covering AI liability. Others, especially the ones we're talking to, are trying to be thoughtful in how to cover it because they know that this is a world that's here to stay and is only going to grow. And so I think the nutshelling of all that is how can we be thoughtful knowing that there's a difference between how humans complete purchases and how agents complete purchases.
Good point. You've raised a lot there, Rosalind, which I thought was fascinating, but it strikes me, Dylan, programmatically, we can't account for all of those parameters, correct?
We can account for the ones that matter. In Reg E, for example, I believe that they say like card, code, or any other means. And I think that other means could probably be elastic enough to include some sort of like agentic credential. But really going back to what Rosalind was saying, I think that having provable authorization before the transaction, that beats disputed authorization after the fact. So it is a technical answer on having the scopes and the authorization requirable, whatever machine enforcement that should exist. But I think that the approach to do that would be having provable authorization, going back to cryptographic proofs versus disputing it after the fact. And maybe it was an agent, maybe it wasn't, and then we get into the weeds.
Dylan, really good point. And Rosalind, I've got to pull you back into something that you said a bit earlier. You used the word disputes, and very clearly in my notes, I have the word disputes circled. I've been thinking about disputes in the context of agentic commerce, certainly, but I'm even thinking, will we see a surge in disputes because of agentic commerce? Will we see a surge in disputes? We often hear about prompt engineering gone wrong. You could imagine an agentic world that's my agent, I did not particularly well prompt, and it spent $1 million on me that I didn't have, for example. Are you concerned about what that future of disputes look like in an agentic world?
Disputes aren't going to go up, Ron. They've already started going up this year due to agentic commerce. And MasterCard published a report, I believe, last week or 2 weeks ago that said that agentic commerce transaction volumes are 0.4% of all transaction volumes being processed now. So we're barely seeing any, and we're already seeing an uptick in chargebacks and fraud. A lot of the major retail organizations we speak with, they've already forecasted increase in chargeback and fraud, as well as disputes. So I think that, honestly, it's a question of, it depends on who you talk to. Some people say that AI innovation is outpacing infrastructure. Some people say, well, we're building the infrastructure and the payment rails now, but we're not going to see adoption on the agentic commerce side yet. So depending on who you talk to and what outpaces what, is once the infrastructure is there, we can actually validate and start to bring down some of that risk in terms of chargeback, fraud, and disputes. But I think it really depends on who you're talking to and what answer you're going to get.
Rosalind, good point. It also brings me to this next kind of discussion point. We just talked about payments broadly. I'm terrified of ever having an agent go onto Amazon and buy anything for me.
Dream, Ron.
Yeah, and my wife's, which is terrifying. But when I look at how financial markets operate, I also think about things like financial transactions, meaning securities trading, crypto trading, for example, and that runs right up against BS, Bank Secrecy Act, and AML KYC requirements. And I guess it's a parallel same question. Are BSA and KYC and AML prepared for a world where we have agents buying and selling in our portfolios, by way of example? And I'll take that a step further because they'll be doing it at a velocity far beyond what you and I could be doing sitting behind a computer entering trades, for example. What does that world look like? How do we account for know your customer or anti-money laundering rules in an agentic commerce world?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the short answer is it goes back to my previous answer on the payment rails, the infrastructure isn't there yet. And I think the legislation isn't there yet, Ron, but it's starting to emerge. And the difference, I think, where you're going to see fintech potentially in general start to outpace some of what we're seeing in other industries is that there's an appetite for that, right? I think people are seeing the potential for increased transaction volume and revenue. And so there's a lot of incentives to try to figure this out as quickly as possible, right? So I think we'll start to see that traction sooner than people might expect.
Rosalind, let me stay with you on that. And Dylan, would love your perspectives on this as well, because all of those transactions require customer identification program requirements. And I'm thinking back to some of the rules we just talked about. I'm thinking about BSA. I'm thinking about KYC. KYC, the C was a person, right? Are we talking about every agent becomes an entity that is represented by a person? I'm really struggling to understand, how do we talk about identity when you look at some of the exchanges, for example? You're talking millions of transactions potentially being done by millions of different agents. How do you narrow that down to who actually owns the identity behind those transactions? And this probably might be a technical answer, Dylan.
That's a great question. So in this context, I think the customer is the human or the business that's at the root of that delegation chain. So that would be what we call the responsible party. So the agent isn't a customer, it's an instrument, right? You can think of a lot of other scenarios where you're not necessarily, going there physically and handing over cash, but maybe even through a subscription, right? That could honestly be an instrument for the customer to do a repayment on a purchase, right? So when it comes to the know your customer KYC component, the idea is that every agent that is doing some sort of interaction that would have a KYC component required to it, then there needs to be an attestation that human is behind the agent, whether that's through a delegation or whether it's through the customer actually created the agent and has its own identity bound to it.
Dylan, just on that point, you mentioned delegation chain. I guess from a security perspective, how do we manage the security and veracity of a delegation chain within agentic commerce? Are we back to cryptographic solutions then?
We're absolutely back to cryptographic solutions when it comes to that. You need to have proofs of that. Otherwise, it's he said, she said, right? We're going from a claims-based industry to a verifiable-based industry. And I think that's the difference here.
Rosalind, anything you want to add to that? Because I do have a question for you.
Our fundamental principle is that, remember, there's no anonymous agent coming to your site. KYA is always going to be backed by KYC, KYB.
Good point. Rosalind, let me stay with you as well, because I come out of Wall Street in the early days when you still had paper boxes and you had little floor reports. It was terrible. All of that being said, a couple of decades ago, we began to see the need for digital suspicious activity reports, or what we know as SARs. You could envision a world where there are going to be a whole lot more SARs transactions. I don't mean to be overstating the velocity and quantity of those transactions in an agentic world. Will agentic commerce make less of a requirement for suspicious activity or more of a requirement for suspicious activity reports?
I remember SARS, Ron. I spent some time on Wall Street back in the day, so I certainly remember them. I would say that it's not a one size fit all answer in terms of there's going to be a cycle around it. And so my anticipation is that if you are hyper vigilant about risk, you'll start to see a spike in SARS. Especially now, it's an emerging industry. It's category creation time with AI and what we're doing in agentic commerce. And so there's going to be a natural spike. And then as some of those headwinds and risks become clearer, then organizations will get smarter about how they can quickly identify them. And so I would expect that to eventually go down as risk teams stay on top of that, right? So I would say that spike and then hopeful potential decline.
Rosalind, it's a really good point. And Dylan, I want to pull you into the SARS conversation, because one of the issues we've seen in the past was false positives for suspicious activity or reports. And again, I don't want to talk about the overwhelm of the velocity and volume of transactions, but you can imagine on a technical level, it'll be more difficult to vet false positives. Or do you feel more relaxed about that proposition?
I think as it stands right now, if systems are only asking currently, does this look human? Those are absolutely going to drown in false positives, right? So the fix would be to annotate transactions with an agent identity. So which agent, which authority, which scope, And then the monitoring can have more agent-aware baselines, and then the signals will be much sharper. Instead of this doesn't look human, it would be this agent is acting outside of its mandate or outside of its scopes of permissions. That's exactly what SARS should be catching.
And there's a memory learning curve for the AI agents themselves that would be doing SARS reporting, for example, that they would learn more over time about the patterns required to report, correct?
Yeah, you could deduce that for sure.
Dylan, Rosalind, thanks. I wanted to segue a little bit. I want to go back to the idea of interoperability, and I think we've commented on it a little bit. Dylan, Rosalind, I'm thinking about X402 is back. And for those of us old enough to remember when the internet was starting, X402 was a placeholder. Now it's a real thing coming out of Coinbase, for example. I'm looking at some of the other platforms. Dylan, I want to talk to you about it from a technical perspective. It strikes me that one of the challenges or benefits will be proper interoperability of all of those platforms, particularly with traditional payment rails, traditional financial rails, arguably some of which are based on data sets and programming that's 50 years old. Is that a challenge that we're prepared to deal with, Dylan, at a technical level?
I think so. When it comes to interoperability, an X402 payment can still link back to the KYC principle. The only thing that's different here is that we have, like with chaos, for example, you have protocol level identity. So the compliance evidence would travel with the transaction itself. So an X402 payment, it can still carry a verifiable link to that principle, even though there may not be a bank that sits in the middle.
Dylan, it's a really good point. Do you anticipate other platforms like X402? Are we going to look at interoperability with a bunch of walled gardens? I guess is one of the product management thoughts I have.
I don't know about walled gardens, but I think it's important that there isn't really one main key holder that kind of is able to answer these sort of questions. So you do need to have some protocol agnosticism, I suppose. Whether it's Agent Pay or X402 from Coinbase, whatever it is, there needs to be that invisible layer, which I would say is what we're trying to solve with chaos. That allows that before the cart, up to the cart, to the transaction, all of that provenance is bundled into it or available. It's very similar to like TLS, right? It's just basically like the security fabric for those requests and exchanges.
Dylan, thanks. Now, I want to wrap up with the regulatory dialogue. One of the things we've talked about at a technical level, persistent memory challenges. Rosalind, in the face of regulations around the world that talk about things like right to be forgotten, I'm thinking EU, I'm thinking California and some other states, I'm thinking UK. To me, that strikes me as a real challenge, because how do you engage with agentic commerce systems, AI-based agents, that can persistently remember things in the face of laws that say you are not allowed to remember those things? What does that look like at a product level?
Ron, that's a very challenging question. I actually don't think they have that figured out just yet, right? So we're actively working, for example, with the EU AI Act. They're doing a pilot sandbox environment, and we're working on kicking the tires and testing out some of these specifications. But I think that's going to be a challenging question for them to figure out. But I'm actually curious, Dylan, if you have a perspective from the technical side in terms of if that's a possibility. Whereas on the business side, we're still dealing with organizations that are on square one of their agentic journey.
That is a good question, Ron. I do think that is something that's not quite figured out. I would say that when it comes to memory, the really crucial thing is just that whether it's any PII, sensitive information, or the actual credentials themselves, that those actually don't sit in memory. So if you're going back to Google's AP2 or Chaos, all of these are in the form of delegations or mandates that represent the actual value of that information that they would need. And on the EU AIAC side, they're mandating an audit layer for agentic systems before payment regulators will have much of a word on it. So that will, I think, tie in the provenance of it. And I'm assuming maybe there's going to be some answers there on memory and proof of what was disclosed and what wasn't.
From a practical standpoint, Ron, what we're seeing with organizations is, like Dylan said, never give them your PII. So there's a lot of restrictions on what AI can access. And what we expect, actually, like my dream is eventually everyone's going to build their own local model that they can truly trust. But that's going to also take some time and investment. And if we're seeing organizations not even use AI note takers, I think it'll be a little while before we get there.
She wants everyone, Dylan, to have their own AI. Look at this.
Dylan knows this. He knows my wish list, my product wish list.
Rosalind, Dylan, I really do appreciate it. And again, I fully get it, Dylan, to your point. Some of these regulations were created before we were even having conversations about agentic AI. And it'll be interesting to see for regulators, how do we prove the negative of this has actually been forgotten on behalf of a particular customer? Rosalind, Dylan, how do people find out more about what you're doing?
You are welcome to find us on LinkedIn or X or Substack, but you can also find us on our website, kya.vouched.id.
Dylan?
So you can absolutely follow us along on the diff side of things as well with the protocol. If you have any inputs or suggestions or even worries, we meet every Tuesday morning and happy to hear.
Please subscribe to the brief on YouTube at mesh-pay and mesh@meshpay on LinkedIn and X.
Rosalind, Dylan, it's great to have you both. Thank you very much.